And the gardener said, "Sir, leave this tree for a year, and I shall cultivate the ground around it and fertilize it, that it may bear fruit in the future. And if not, then you can cut it down." Inch by inch and row by row, gonna make my garden grow. All I need is a rake and a hoe and a piece of fertile ground. Inch by inch and row by row, someone bless these seeds I sow. Someone warm them from below till the rain comes tumbling down. Well, that's the old garden song, I think put out in the mid-'70s by singer John Mallett. It became a folk classic and, of course, subsequently is pretty standard in American culture, at least, for children to learn that song as little kids in almost every place, at least in this country and maybe in other parts of the world. The garden song, a song about growing bit by bit, allowing things to grow and doing our part to make them grow. Well, in today's gospel this week of Lent, Jesus uses the image of a gardener that pleads with the landowner to say, although something hasn't been productive for 3 years, still, give me a chance to cultivate it. Things can turn around, things can grow. This week of the Lenten season, you and I may, in fact, feel like we need a chance to grow. Maybe we're feeling like we or our world or situations we're in just aren't moving, and maybe they haven't seemed productive for a while. And yet, our God is a God like that gardener who says we can still make it grow. We can still do what we need to do to cultivate it, to fertilize things. We can mix things up and allow them with some kinds of maybe disruptions, good and healthy disruptions, with ways in which we stir up the stuff, the dirt. We can, in fact, see some growth in it. It's a beautiful image and one that gives me incredible hope as we move in this next week into Earth Day. It might not be a bad image for us at this point in our Lenten journey as we contemplate what it takes for us to look for that special grace given to each one of us in this Lenten season, this year, that will enable us to maybe restart, to reboot our lives, and maybe allow us to see in a new way, a renewed way, a reimagining of how we can play a different role, not only in our personal lives and the lives of those we love and the lives of those we work with, but maybe even a different role in the world, a world that maybe needs that reimagination, that needs that renewal and restart, that recreation. And so let us think about that image that Jesus gives us of the gardener in the gospel this week is not an unusual one. In fact, I would argue that image in some ways bookends the very story of salvation. Here in our chapel of St. Joseph, when it was built, Father Dennis McNally, a Jesuit priest who was a longtime member of our art department, he designed the windows done by this rather noted German stained glass company, but they're his designs. And he decided that the 3 windows, because the chapel could only handle these 3 large windows, that each of the windows would represent one of the persons of the Trinity. And so he began with that image of God the Creator, and he uses in there, among several images and swaths of color, the hands, the creative hands, fostering the tree of life, an image common in Genesis, and certainly one that's used by others, especially in the Abrahamic tradition, that God gives us a word and a promise that is a tree of life that keeps growing and branching out. And so he really emphasized in that image of God the Creator, that image of a tree beginning, and he focuses on a seed. You can see the seed in the ground and the hands cultivating it. Well, Interestingly enough, as that story of salvation plays out in the journey of the Jewish people and God's constant fidelity and faithfulness to them, even though they may keep going astray, there's that fidelity that leads all the way up into God's very entrance into our reality as a human being in Jesus of Nazareth. St. Ignatius's contemplation on the Incarnation allows us to even imagine what would have motivated God, what were God's desires for the world and for us when God decided to extend God's self into the world through Jesus of Nazareth. That extension of God and into the fullness of our experience, all of our experience, therefore redeeming everything in the created world and everything in our human reality and our human experience, nothing left out. And so Father McNally imaged the Redeemer, God who redeems us, as Jesus on a more fully grown cross that is also the tree of life. It's rooted into the ground with that story, that creation story of the first ancestors, Eve and Adam, with an emphasis on how the root also looks like the snake, the serpent that offered them that apple, that seed-filled apple of knowledge. And there it is, Jesus hanging on a tree, surrounded by the first ancestors with flames of fire and lots of green growth. It's not accidental that when Jesus was crucified and laid in a tomb, the first person to discover the empty tomb was Mary, his friend, and she couldn't see him at first, and she mistook him as a gardener there in the garden. So the story begins in this Garden of Eden with this God, the Creator, the one who plants and cultivates and grows the world and the created reality you and I live in. And it, of course, ends in another garden, that place of great sadness and tragedy, and yet the first time Jesus is seen as risen, as fulfilling what had been promised through him, he's mistaken for a gardener. And so in today's gospel, and maybe in our lives, we may feel called to grow something new in ourselves so that we can be agents of new growth in our world, because so much of what's around us seems to be disintegrating and seems to be destructive as we continue to look at war, and a war that wages horribly in Ukraine. But there have been other trouble spots in the world for far too long, increased violence in so many places, 84 million displaced people, and now added to that number around the world are now 5 or 6 million displaced Ukrainians. But the number was already overwhelming. A huge portion of our own human population, our own brothers and sisters, either internally displaced or pushed out of their country for economic reasons, or because of war, or because of poverty. And so our world needs new growth, my friends, and we need new growth in this Lenten season, and it's a both and the project of growing. So we need that grace that nourishes us, that fertilizes that growth of who we are as human beings to move us forward. And like I said, this week we may be contemplating that new growth as we move towards later in the next month, that celebration of Earth Day. Or it might be as we just contemplate the new bursts of growth that come in this spring season. Or it might be this way in which you and I really think about our own personal behaviors and actions in light of what not only needs to grow in us, what not needs to be done for ourselves by way of creating a more holistic and healthier life so that we can live fully those holy desires that God has planted in you and me, as St. Ignatius says, but that we can in fact live those whole and holy lives, as Vatican II said, we're all called, every single one of us, to a holiness. Well, that holiness comes by living more holistically and embracing the world in a whole way and loving with a wholeness that can only come with our own self-healing and repair. And only God's grace can assist us in that journey, that we make the choices we need to make that are better for ourselves, that allow us to live happier, healthier, and holy lives. And when we do that, then we can be contributors to that new growth in the world. Because of our own health and growth, we can become gardeners of a sort. We can be those who foster life in every form, for those yet to be born, all the way to those who are in some ways passing into the fullness of life, and everybody in between. And we do that in a way that allows us to live that life by God's grace. So here we are in the middle of this Lenten season, my friends, and as we journey and we say, God, we give you a message. Here's a memo to you, God. We want to live in a way that allows us to be renewed this moment, this season of Lent. May the grace that we're given in this holy season be one that allows us to grow as we need to grow in whatever way is necessary for each and every one of us. Ignatius of Loyola, in his spiritual exercises, makes the point that God works with us uniquely, each and every single one of us, because each of us has holy desires planted within us, and God gives us the grace to let those holy desires grow so that we may become the person we're called to be. That grace allows us to discern and to choose and to keep growing as human beings. And so it happens, inch by inch, row by row, step by step, one moment after another, one day at a time. We do that. And so maybe like that old garden song sung so long ago by Dave Mallet, that not only became a classic folk song of the 70s, but is now a constant introduction to every child practically into how growth is part of their life, growth in themselves, and how they can be growers, gardeners, cultivators of a thriving world that's full of life. And in that, maybe inch by inch and row by row, let's see how not only our garden can grow, but how we can go through this season of Lent in order to row by row and bit by bit become the people we're called to be by God's grace. Let us continue this Lenten journey open to that grace, open, as we say in Jesuit education, to new growth, so that we can, from the beginning of our story with a God who cultivated and grew in us a holy desire along with the beginnings of the world, that same Creator God sees a fulfillment in letting us grow through Jesus Christ into where we're called now to be those caretakers of our own lives, those caretakers of each other, and those caretakers of our common home, this planet in all its life forms. May we continue that growth. Amen.